Many thanks to Fellow Extraction Squad, Classman in the servers, Sergeant Peppers, Sea of Souls Cloud, Sovereign RP server, the Struggle Community, the Karma Crew servers, Darts, Designful, Friendly DayZ podcast, and the settlement for making this video possible. DayZ hides an invisible world of loot spawn points that makes it feel like the buildings are spawning the loot, but in this video I'm going to be exposing how loot actually works in DayZ and where that loot is coming from, how loot gets selected to spawn, despawn, and then respawn again, and why some items feel impossible to find while others literally don't spawn at all. Many players believe that loot is found in buildings, and this can really throw you off because some buildings in DayZ don't spawn any loot, so it's actually found in what are called loot groups, which are these cylindrical shapes attached to buildings and structures around the map. While this still technically means that buildings and structures do spawn loot, loot groups are what's important and what you should be thinking about, because any part of a building that is not covered by a loot group does not spawn any loot, as shown here. This building is actually 3 different structures put together to make it look like it's a building, with each structure having its own loot group and its own set of stats for how many of what can spawn here. The most important stat for loot groups is certainly loot max, which defines the maximum number of items that can potentially spawn inside this group. This is then further restricted on most loot groups by a color-coded category. As you can see on the right here, there's a lot of different colors which all have their own loot maximums and spawn certain types of gear, so they're basically categories. In this case, the loot max of this staircase or this loot group is 3, but the loot max of the weapon category inside this loot group is 2, so a maximum of 2 weapons can spawn inside this loot group. Now, which type of loot spawns depends where the loot group or the structure is positioned on the map. This is really important to know. So the newsstand at this castle here will spawn clothing like chainmail, but the newsstand at Chernogorsk will spawn something like jeans. They both spawn clothing, but they both have different types of loot. Even though they have the exact same model, they have the same loot group, the exact same spawn points in the same positions, and all of the categories and numbers are basically the same. They are the same, they're just in different locations. This happens because different areas have different loot tags assigned to them, like military here and firefighter there, and because the first newsstand is in a historical area, it can spawn chainmail because chainmail spawns at historical loot tags, where the second newsstand is in a town area, so it's restricted to spawning clothes found in the town loot tag. The final form of loot restriction on these loot groups comes in the form of tiers, which basically works exactly like the tags do, but ranging from tier 1 to 4, with tier 1 loot being low value and tier 4 being better but harder to get to. Most loot groups in DayZ have these loot nodes inside of them, which is where the items that loot group can spawn will appear. Each of these nodes is color coded like the categories that we spoke about earlier, so this color node here spawns weapon related stuff, so magazines, weapon attachments, and even weapons themselves. However, there is yet another restriction at play with how big that node is. The smaller the node, the smaller the item that can spawn there, so a weapon node that is very small will be restricted to only spawning small weapons like pistols and SMGs, and not rifles, because they just can't fit inside it. This applies to all nodes of all categories, not just weapon nodes, and explains why the M4 can be found in these riffid containers outside, but larger contaminated area weapons like the SVD cannot. The node is not big enough for the SVD to spawn here, unless you're on a server that has increased the size of these spawn points found in these containers. Another restriction for these spawn points is proxies, or in other words, spawn points that can spawn the exact same loot every single time. They are very rare and look different to regular nodes. As you can see, this is a proxy spawn point, mostly appearing in the Livonia bunker, and are responsible for forcing items to appear in certain loot groups, such as the tactical helmet with NVGs on this crate, the AUG AX over here, the green plate carrier on level 2, and even these ammo boxes here. If I force them to spawn, they will spawn only one item ever. The night vision goggles that can be found on these tactical helmets here works exactly like all other attachments that could be found on or inside of other items in the game, with NVGs having an 85% chance to spawn on this helmet in this case, so sometimes you're not going to find the NVGs here. Items attached to other items are not restricted to loot areas or loot tiers and don't count towards the loot maximum or loot group either, so it doesn't affect the loot group when it's attached to another item. So while the AK suppressor is restricted to spawning at static gas zones on Chernogorsk only, it has a 5% chance to spawn on an AKM, and because the AKM can be found at tier 4 military areas instead, it technically means that the AK suppressor is found in tier 4 military as well as gas zones. This also applies to items found at dynamic events, which yet again is another type of restriction in DayZ, as only items that have been assigned to spawn at dynamic events will spawn at dynamic events. Helis and convoys, they are restricted to them. However, even dynamic events have a loot group with heli crashes spawning military related stuff, but do be aware that there is no tier assigned to this structure or this loot group. So that means that tools, containers, clothes and weapons of every military tier can spawn at a heli crash, and also on top of that you're going to get dynamic event restricted items that spawn here too. From all the restrictions you've seen in this video, you probably understand that loot is very complicated in DayZ, and loot is distributed completely randomly across the map as long as it lands inside one of these potential spawn points, with how many of certain items spawning being capped at a maximum number that's attached to that item. In the case of the repeater, on a completely fresh server, 50 are going to spawn across all potential locations, with a potential spawn point looking like a loot group that's in either a farm or a village area, is in tier 2, 3 or 4, has a weapon category inside of its loot group, and the weapon spawn point is also big enough to fit the repeater too. That is a potential spawn point for the repeater, but it's not guaranteed to spawn there. All items also have a minimum number assigned to them, so when these repeaters get picked up and looted by players, or they disappear or despawn from the map, that number will go down, and when it hits the minimum of 40 for the repeater, 10 more will spawn almost instantly to fill up other spawn points so that it reaches 50 again. Now, some items are designed to not strictly follow this maximum and minimum rule, and you can end up with none on a map for a period of time, and with some rarer items like the best weapons in the game, carrying that item on your player or putting it inside a storage chest will count towards the maximum on a server, so that means you literally cannot loot this weapon unless you steal it from another player. This is made even more complicated by how all loot in DayZ has individual lifetimes and will remain at a spawn point until that lifetime reaches 0. When this timer reaches 0, that item will despawn, freeing up this spawn point to spawn something similar to the previous item, or perhaps even the exact same item again. However, each spawn point has a cooldown period, which I won't go into detail on, but I can say that no loot will spawn at all at this spawn point if any player is within 100 meters of it. These cooldown periods, lifetimes and the loot itself are preserved between server restarts, and even dynamic events get remembered, so when the server comes back online, the dynamic event and all of that loot is still going to be there. This, combined with how complex loot is and it's distributed so randomly and you can't really tell which spawn point is where, you can't even see the spawn points, it just makes spawn point density all the more powerful to use. Spawn point density is all that really matters in most cases. The more spawn points there are in an area for you to search that spawns the loot that you want, the more likely you are to find that loot. That's all you really need to know, with the loot probability tool ranking the spawn point density for all items in the game to highlight the best areas to search basically. If you want more information than that, the Loot Finder 1 or 2 will give you more info such as maximums and minimums, the areas and also the tiers, and it highlights most importantly where it's been found previously. However, once you've seen where an item spawns in the game in a certain location, you now know, confirmed by this video, that it certainly has a chance to spawn there again if the devs don't change anything. So the best way to learn what spawns where is simply playing the game. A big thanks to Old School for the idea for this video. Thank you very much for watching and have a good day.